Hello, in this video, we're going to look at the effects of rent control, a summary of the literature. First, a couple quotes. Paul Krugman writes, "The analysis of rent control is among the best understood issues in all of economics, and, among economists anyway, one of the least controversial. In 1992, a poll of the American Economic Association found 93% of its members agreeing that a ceiling on rents reduces the quality and quantity of housing." A Swedish economist, Lindbeck, famously stated, "Next to bombing, rent control seems in many cases to be the most efficient technique so far known for destroying cities." And the last quote I'll share is from Wilhelm Röpke, a German economist, who argues that rent control is really nothing but the protection of one privileged special kind of tenants, those with old leases, at the expense of the landlords and later tenants alike. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the key findings from this article by Konstantin Kolodilin. The title is Rent Control Effects Through the Lens of Empirical Research, an almost complete review of the literature. The author identified 206 studies on rent control from 1967 through 2023, with 112 of them representing empirically based published articles. The studies may deal with different aspects of rent control, from effects on rent, quality, mobility, misallocation, new construction, and so on. So let's start with the empirical findings. You'll notice here the darker shaded area or blue area are the published articles the author looked at, and the gray area represents the unpublished articles. So we're going to start here with controlled rents. There are 60 studies that looked at the effect of rent control on rental prices. The negative effect means these studies found that rent control reduced rents. The 0 here indicates no effect, and the positive indicates that rent control actually increased the rental prices. So what we see here is rent control has a negative effect on rental prices. 53 of the 60 studies find a statistically significant effect that people in rent control units end up paying lower rents. This is not surprising. Another thing that was looked at in studies is mobility. 26 studies looking at mobility. Here you see the majority of studies are finding that rent control reduces mobility. So almost all studies show that rent control has a negative effect on mobility. Residents living in controlled dwellings have limited motivation to relocate. They possess concerns that finding a residence of similar quality at such a low rental cost might be challenging. Rent control laws may also make it more difficult for landlords to remove tenants, also reducing mobility. This reduced mobility means people are less likely to reallocate for better job matches, negatively affecting labor markets. The other thing looked at in the study was home ownership. In general, studies find that rent control increases home ownership rates because shortages of rent-controlled units lead people to seek other housing options. All right, we're going to look at two things on this slide. We're going to look at construction and housing quality. Construction over here, 16 studies. Most of these studies find that rent control reduces construction, has a negative effect on construction. So the preponderance of studies show that rent control reduces the number of new housing units. In terms of housing quality, we see that rent control has a negative effect on housing quality. Quote from the article, "Rent control leads to a deterioration in the quality of those dwellings subject to rent regulations. The landlords whose revenues are eroded by rent control have reduced incentives to invest in maintenance and refurbishment. Thus, they let their properties wear out until the real value of the dwellings decreases and becomes equal to the low real rent." The next batch of studies here looked at uncontrolled rents, 17 studies doing that. Here we find, as a rule, rent control leads to higher rents for uncontrolled dwellings. The imposition of rent ceilings amplifies a shortage of housing. The demand for unregulated housing increases, as people have difficulty finding rent-controlled housing units. Now we're going to look at supply. 16 studies looking at supply. The majority of these studies find a negative effect on supply. So almost all published studies indicate that rent control reduces the stock of rental housing units. As seen earlier, rent control also reduces the flow of new housing units by reducing new construction. The reduction of supply can imply its physical disappearance through demolition, merger of smaller dwellings into bigger ones, conversion of residential premises into non-residential uses, and conversion of rental dwellings into owner-occupied ones. And misallocation, 13 studies here all find that rent control leads to a misallocation here of resources. Tenants in controlled dwellings may have fewer incentives to leave since they are well protected and have cheap dwellings. Even if the family situation of these people changes, for example, their adult children leave the nest, these people do not change their dwellings, whereas young families who need such spacious dwellings are struggling to find appropriate dwellings. Misallocation can pertain to an unfair redistribution of resources despite the intention of rent control to assist low-income households. The actual outcome can be more advantageous for individuals with higher incomes. All right, that is it.